We know how the whole thing turns out. The people back then did not know. They didn't know their future any more than we know our future. They were taking risks. They were making big decisions. It's easy for us to assume we know how it all turned out. We emerged as the greatest nation the world's ever known, the richest nation. It's hard to get back to that time when these small little towns are making these momentous decisions that affect the future. We're here in the First Parish Church of Lexington, where the first events took place. And I'm speaking here with Bob Gross, and the author of a wonderful book, the best book ever written on the battles of Lexington and Concord.
I'm approaching the 50th anniversary of its publication. You've written books still in print that are already past their half century. And yet, going back to these moments of formation of things, we become young again.
I realize my lifetime, I've lived over a third of the nation's history in one lifetime. That's, when you think about it in those terms, we're a very young country, 250 years. This point of April 19th, you found that they used that date. Not the Battle of Lexington or the Battle of Concord. They said the way we knew 9/11, they used April 19th. Is that correct?
Yeah, for years I had been looking at research into the memory of this date and battle. And I had read, the people often in Concord called it the Concord fight. Naturally, Lexington called it the Lexington fight. But when you did searches in early American newspapers for like 50 years between 1776 and 1825, you got maybe 80 hits for a Concord fight and maybe 160 for a Lexington fight. Only a couple of weeks ago did I realize, why don't you search on 19th of April? And April 19th was a digit. And then suddenly there were thousands of hits. So it was 4/19, 9/11, July 4th.
Yeah.
That we seem to have a cultural practice that historical turning points are remembered by the day and year. So on April 14th of 1775, Governor Thomas Gage, the general who'd been put in charge of the rebellious province of Massachusetts Bay, got a letter from his boss, Lord Dartmouth, back in London in Whitehall, saying, it's about time. We're tired of waiting for you to crack down on Massachusetts Bay. You have orders to go out to Concord and seize the weapons and supplies that the town and the Provincial Congress of Massachusetts have been stocking up on in anticipation that there might be a war, and we want you to arrest all the ringleaders of the rebellion. And that includes Samuel Adams and John Hancock and Colonel James Baird of Concord and everybody you can get. But Gage wrote him and said, I need 20,000 men. I've only got about 3,500. And Gage understood that the rebellion could be broken only by military oppression.
So the Brits from 3,000 miles away really underestimated what they were dealing with.
Yeah.
Right from the beginning.
Because it wasn't just political. Also, they misunderstood the society from which the politics sprang.
I think the crucial moment is the Tea Party. That was appalling to many people in the colonies. George Washington thought that the destruction of private property was just beyond the pale. That was not something that should be done. And he regarded the Massachusetts people as kind of wild Puritans. But the British reacted in a way that played into Samuel Adams's hands. They came forth with the coercive acts, which the colonists called the intolerable acts, a series of acts that simply scared everyone from Massachusetts to South Carolina. They closed the port of Boston. They did away with the Massachusetts Bay Charter. So it was a major turning point, and Washington looked at that and he said, if they can do that to Massachusetts, they can do that to Virginia. In a sense, the British continentalized the resistance movement, and everybody got on board. You had the first meeting of the Continental Congress in the fall of 1774 in response to these intolerable acts. And from that, you get to the situation in Massachusetts. By April, the situation was very volatile. The clash of arms that occurred would have occurred inevitably, I think, sooner or later, because they were primed to resist. Sooner or later, something was bound to happen. And that is the context for April 19th, 1775.
Gage wants to break the rebellion by seizing the weapons. He was basically sending the troops out on what we came to learn, especially in the Vietnam War, a search and destroy mission.
Mm-hmm.
And it has to be, in his mind, a surprise preemptive attack, kept secret until it's launched. On the night of April 18th, he's given orders to Colonel Francis Smith to bring about 700 or so grenadiers and light infantry, march them through the countryside, head for Concord. So Lexington was just a place you're passing through.
I see.
In the original orders. And go to Concord, seize the weapons, and come back, and do not harass the civilians.
Uh-huh.
You know, don't steal their property, don't invade their homes, except to look for the weapons. And one key thing is that this was not a search for materials that nobody knew where they were. Gage had spies in the Massachusetts Provincial Congress and in Concord who had sent him the locations of every single place where military materials were stored.
So it was supposed to be secret, but obviously the patriots, the colonists, had some way of knowing, because this is where the Paul Revere comes into play, or
Yeah.
the story of Paul Revere. What happened there?
The British were spying on the resistance in Massachusetts in the Provincial Congress, and all the people of Boston had their eyes out for what the British Army was doing constantly. So they were well aware when Gage ordered officers to go out in the evening and patrol the roads. This was the sign that they were going to be marching. So already, well before Paul Revere had arranged for lanterns to show, one if by land, that is, if they were going to go over Boston Neck out in the countryside, or two if by sea, if they were going to go across the Charles and land at Lechmere Point in Cambridge. Well before he'd done that, already people were aware that something was up. And everybody knew, not that Gage had gotten his letter, but they knew that the crisis had reached a breaking point.
And the Brits might try to seize their arms.
And more than that, the Provincial Congress had already, about a month before, set up a system of couriers to carry the news. And the news was to be this: when the British regulars went out in a number of more than 500, with their baggage and weapons, that would be a sign to send the alarm. And in their march into the countryside, what provincials should do, in Concord in particular, was form an army of observation.
Don't shoot.
Don't shoot.
Okay.
Don't fire unless fired upon. And a key thing to know is that this was hardly the first search and destroy mission.
The whole atmosphere was very volatile.
It was really volatile.
It was,
nobody wanted a war, but everybody was gearing up for it.
tension was so high that sooner or later there was going to be an exchange of fire. And once you start killing each other, it's really hard to go back. What happened at Lexington? They were just passing by, but some people are on the common.
The alarm goes out, the British are marching. The militia companies under Captain John Parker of Lexington have assembled. They'd gotten an early warning in the middle of the night, and no British, so they go off to neighboring taverns or homes. By the time the second alarm comes, there are maybe half as many who come back out. And they're standing there.
What number, though? Half as many? How many?
So from 130, it's down to about 65,
60?
70.
I see.
And so they're waiting there. Meanwhile, Paul Revere has come through with his warning that Adams and Hancock better get out of here because the regulars are on the march. He, on the way to Concord, along with William Dawes, had been stopped by British sentries. Revere, when he's captured by the British troops, says in a bald-faced lie, there are 500 people waiting for you. So the regulars carry that message back, and now the oncoming British force is anticipating a huge army to resist them.
Even in Lexington?
Yeah.
No. Wow.
They're thinking there are going to be 500 people. They come and they could have made their way to Concord and avoided the militiamen. They see the men there. Parker gives them the order, disperse, disperse. Don't fire unless you're fired upon. And then up comes Pitcairn and says, disperse, you rebels, disperse. Somewhere, somebody fires. We don't know who. And Pitcairn had told them not to fire until they got orders. But suddenly, his troops, unload.
So some colonists are killed.
Yeah, so 7 people they did.
Wow. And
more
no
injured.
Brits were killed?
1 lightly injured.
I see.
So no one's ever been able to pin down who fired the first shot. But clearly, the soldiers and everybody, they're all on a knife's edge. So then, finally, Pitcairn gets control of the troops, and they march out of Lexington, but firing sounds of triumph. Huzzah, huzzah.
Right.
And now they're making their way to Concord. The people in Concord send out in advance a number of Minutemen to see what's happening on the route into town. So maybe several hundred yards separate them from the oncoming British regulars. And as they're getting close, the Minutemen basically do an about-face and march into town playing fifes and drums as if they're leading a parade. Meanwhile, the British regulars are also playing fifes and drums. And Amos Barrett, who gives us the account, says, we had grand music. And everybody remembers the sun gleaming on the bayonets and the bright red uniforms. These are the shock troops of the British Army.
Yeah.
So they march in, take the center of town, which is largely deserted. Smith dispatches units to go to the North Bridge and to the South Bridge. Concord has a place where, 2 rivers run through it and become one, the Concord River. And if you can control the bridges, you've controlled access to the town center. And they know that's where most of the weapons and stores are being kept. So they send out 4 or 5 companies to the North Bridge, several of which go on to Colonel Barrett's farmhouse because they know that they've stored weapons there and they want to arrest him. Meanwhile, you've got a small number of soldiers, maybe 150 or so British soldiers, holding the North Bridge. Minuteman companies and militia companies are answering the alarm from Concord's neighbors, Acton, Bedford, Lincoln, and Westford, farther into the countryside. So by the early morning, you've got some 400 provincials staring at 100, 150 British regulars across the distance of 100, 200 yards. So now the question is, what sparks the conflict? And this is one of the stories about, it was inevitable, but it was accidental. The provincials are on a hill looking over into the bridge and across into town. And they see smoke rising from the center of town. Smoke is rising because regulars are creating a bonfire of a lot of the military stores. And sparks from that bonfire right on the town common catch on the townhouse, which is also the courthouse. And a woman, a widow named Martha Moulton, who's stuck in the center, pleads with the British troops to please put out that fire.
And they do, don't they?
Yeah, but first they ignore her, and then the smoke is really rising, and they do lend their efforts to put it out.
People think that Brits are burning the town.
Lieutenant Joseph Hosmer, who will become the revolutionary hero of the town, looks and he says, the British have bragged that they can march to our towns, devastate them, and we'll do nothing. And he points at the smoke and he says, will you let them burn the town down? With that, they march. But strict orders, you don't fire, let them fire first.
So who fires first?
So the British regulars fire warning shots, and as the provincials get closer, they then fire directly at them. And what shocked them was this large force
Shocked the Brits.
maintained its discipline, did not run away. They fired, and it's the British regulars who in fact panic and flee. The really striking thing is that British lose command, don't regroup, allow the militiamen to march over the bridge into the town, but no further conflict. There's Smith in the center of town. He's decided, okay, that's the end of our searching. We've done everything wrong. We've pillaged the civilians. We've created the war we wanted to avoid. Let's make our way back. By this point, and by the end of the day, some 4,000 provincials will have answered the call.
So how many regulars are lost?
We're about 274.
And
A casualty rate of
what was the total
about
Patriot?
20%. Patriot rate is about 2%.
Given from what your book and what you're saying, it seems there would be an inevitable clash of arms at some point, and people would die, and then it's a whole new situation. Yeah. Now, it takes a while to get to the Declaration of Independence, but the beginnings so small in a sense, and yet leading to the creation of a nation that now dominates the world. It's really an extraordinary story when you think about it.
Here's the thing. Just as Paul Revere was not the lone rider whom Longfellow summons up in his poem, so towns were not responding to the alarm as if, oh my God, what's happening? They were really well prepared, and that in effect, Massachusetts displays how well organized its townships were and how much they were ready to follow the rule of law and to carry out a resistance in the name of the charter. And to them, that meant what they had inherited from the Puritan ancestors and what they'd inherited revised from the grandchildren of the Puritan ancestors who'd negotiated the 1691 charter. That was a legacy that they were obliged to preserve intact in honor of the sacrifices of blood and treasure that their forefathers had made, fleeing Archbishop Laud, fleeing Charles I, crossing the ocean, fighting Indian wars. And it was their responsibility to maintain that heritage intact for posterity.